Let's talk about the C word, collusion. The word collusion started dominating the conversation around the Trump presidency shortly after he was inaugurated. Generally, it means a secret agreement or cooperation between two parties, especially for an illegal or deceitful purpose. But in this context, it means a possible secret agreement or cooperation between the Trump campaign team and Russian actors in order to help him win the presidency. There's a lot of skepticism and confusion out there regarding Trump and the Russian collusion story. It's a complicated story with a lot of unreliable narrators, but there are basic underlying facts to the story, and that's what we want to focus on in this episode. President Trump has tweeted constantly and with regularity that there is no collusion and nothing at all to the Russia story where he's concerned. A majority of Americans, however, disagree with that and want to know more, according to polls that show that they have little trust in Trump's denials. There is majority support for the special counsel's independent investigation into these ties. So, what are the actual facts? The Center for American Progress, a progressive think tank, has a research arm that's put together the Moscow Project, an exhaustive and comprehensive look at all of the business connections between the Trump organization and Russian individuals dating back to the 1990s. And they have a timeline of events that helps put everything in perspective. Max Bergman is the director of the Moscow Project. He formerly worked at the US State Department. His policy and research background are a big part of this project, and you'll hear from him shortly. Outside of the question of political collusion, there hasn't been a ton of mainstream discussion about what the financial connections actually are between Team Trump and Russian oligarchs. You're going to get an in-depth look that outlines who the key players are, from his American business partners to the multiple officials from the Russian and post-Soviet sphere who lent money to Trump business dealings. We know it's confusing. The Moscow Project has put together a handy presentation guide so you can follow along. You're also going to hear from Diana Pilipenko, the Associate Director for Anti-Corruption and Illicit Finance for the project. Prior to joining this team, Diana worked for a major accounting firm doing corporate investigations focusing on issues of corruption in Eastern Europe. Make sure you stick around after the presentations and let us know your thoughts in the comments while you're watching. We're going to be following up with questions about what we know so far and trying to make sense of this whole thing. Thank you guys for watching NowThis.
Thank you, Versha. Thank you, NowThis, for having us. What we hope to do today is to give you a better sense of the Trump-Russia scandal, to try to make it make sense. Now, if you're following this scandal, it's easy to get lost in the weeds. It's a little bit like we're standing just a few inches back from a Monet painting or some classic Impressionist painting, where you can see all the brushstrokes, but you don't actually know what the painting is unless you take a step back. And so we are going to try to take a step back to try to explain what the big picture is here. And we think it is a rather simple story. It's a story of a businessman who is trying to curry favor with his foreign investors. It's about a foreign government, the Russian government, trying to strike back at the United States. And ultimately, it's about a political campaign willing to do whatever it takes to win. And I think what's a good starting point is actually after the election. On January 6th of 2017 is when the U.S. intelligence community issued a unanimous report. And this report told us that there were, in fact, two campaigns to elect Donald Trump. That there was the Trump campaign to elect Donald Trump, and there was a Russian campaign to elect Donald Trump. That the Russians, in fact, ran a political campaign to influence the U.S. election. And so to believe there was no collusion, what you have to believe is these two campaigns operated entirely independently, that there was no connection between them, that there was a bright line. But then what we found out over the coming past year or so is that there was constant meetings and contacts between these two campaigns. So what we're going to try to do in this presentation is to try to explain this. At times this can seem like something out of a bad spy novel, but to really understand this story you need to go back to the beginnings of Donald Trump's businesses and to look at the connections that developed between Donald Trump and the Russians. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Diana.
As you know, Donald Trump has consistently maintained that he has no business in Russia. However, there is now overwhelming evidence to suggest that Russia has business in Donald Trump. Not only has Russian money helped fuel his comeback from multiple bankruptcies in the 90s, but it has also sustained him during the global financial crisis, when he continued building both domestically and abroad. Various individuals in Trump's orbit, including his own children, have commented on the vast amounts of Russian money that's tied up in their assets. We, of course, have this famous quote from Don Jr. from September 2008 that says, "Russians make up a disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets." Not only is the source of the statement critical, but also the timing. September 2008 is right as the global financial crisis is setting in. Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy right around this time. And so while others are losing money, Trump Organization sees money pouring in. And so every story has a beginning, and the story of Trump and Russia begins with money. In the 1990s and well into 2000s, the Trump Organization is hemorrhaging money. In 1990, it is $3.4 billion in debt. Trump is personally liable for over $800 million. Again, in 1995, Trump declares $1 billion on his income, in losses on his income tax returns. On two other occasions, in 2004 and 2009, the Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts files for bankruptcy. And we can go to the next slide, please. After the second bankruptcy in 2009, Trump steps down as the chairman of this organization. And so because of these repeated business failures, traditional Wall Street banks refuse to lend Trump money. In fact, bankers coin a term, the Donald risk, when explaining their aversion to doing business with him. And yet he continues to build project after project from the 1990s well into 2000s. And so the question arises, how is somebody able to simultaneously confront multiple bankruptcies, Wall Street stigma, and yet continue to build? The answer as we see it is in part from financing and development assistance done by companies linked to Russia and the former Soviet Union. This is a mutually beneficial relationship. In the 1990s, just as the Soviet Union fell apart, there emerges an oligarch class. A handful of savvy businessmen buy up state-owned assets for a fraction of their cost. And so there's this private wealth creation. Immense wealth is amassed, and yet the country itself remains incredibly volatile, both politically and economically. And so these newly minted wealthy elites look for safe harbors outside of the country to park their money. At this time, we see that foreign real estate really emerges as one of the preferred means to store their newly found wealth. And so much capital flight goes into cities like London, New York, Miami. And Trump, someone who's down on his luck financially, sees this as a way to get back on his feet. In 1998, for instance, in August, Russia declares defaults on $40 billion in debt. The ruble plummets, the economy is on the verge of collapse, and so there's this capital flight. About a month or so later, Trump breaks ground on Trump World Tower in Manhattan. By 2004, we know that a third of the premium units are occupied and are sold to LLCs and individuals linked to Russia and the former Soviet Union. And this is according to investigative reporters who have meticulously documented these sales. And so this cultivation of the Russian consumer continues well beyond the 90s into 2000s. We see this from various statements from individuals like Sergei Milyan, who's commented that the business between Trump and Russia has amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's also the purchase of the Palm Beach property by Dmitry Rybovlev in 2008. And so we see this, the Trump Organization in essence sees the Russian consumer as a way to circumvent the traditional banks. And we can go to the next slide for another quote. From Eric Trump, who in essence says the Russian buyers now are the best consumers. And so with the banks not willing to lend to the Trump Organization, this sort of new market that emerges for them is very fortuitous. And so because of the dynamic that emerges, we begin to scrutinize the various developments that the Trump Organization has undertaken. Trump Soho in particular raises nearly 50 floors of questions. This is a development that was financed largely by the Bayrock Group, a company with offices in the Trump Tower. The Bayrock Group was started by multiple individuals from the former Soviet Union, including Tevfik Arif. And one of the executives of the group is somebody that we're all familiar with, Felix Aider. This was an interesting project, and there were many allegations swirling around the sources of finance that went into building of the tower. But not only are we looking at who's financing the projects, but also who's buying the individual units and with what intent. A notable example is Viktor Khrapunov. He's a former Kazakh government official, a one-time mayor of Almaty. He was accused of stealing state assets and laundering the money through high-end real estate, including by purchasing 3 units in Trump Soho for $3 million. So Khrapunov, of course, has denied allegations of wrongdoing, and the related cases are currently ongoing in New York and California courts. Perhaps the most troubling connection to come out of the Trump Soho development is Felix Aider. As I mentioned, he was an executive with the Bayrock Group and also Trump's long-term business associate. Felix Aider, of course, is the same individual that attempted to help Trump build a Trump Tower in Moscow, along with his childhood friend Michael Cohen, as late as 2015, when Trump was already on the presidential campaign trail. Felix Aider is also the same individual who has also tried to set up a back-channel discussion between Michael Flynn, then National Security Advisor, and a pro-Kremlin Ukrainian politician, also with the help of Michael Cohen. The topic of the discussion was, among other things, the lifting of sanctions against Russia. And so in an individual like Felix Aider, we see somebody who seamlessly transitions from a long-term business associate to somebody who inserts himself into the campaign as well as the transition, and somebody who, in essence, tries to affect policymaking. And this relationship then underscores the need to continually probe the long-standing business relationships that Trump has had. As colorful as Trump Soho is, it's not the only development that lays bare some of these troubling connections, but also an influx of Russian money that's used to sustain the developments. There's also Trump Toronto. This project was also largely financed and developed by an individual, by Alexander Schneider, a commodities trader from the former Soviet Union. When the project encountered significant financial difficulty, there was an interesting transaction that helped fuel the building of the project. In essence, Vneshekonombank, a Russian state-owned bank, purchased a stake in Schneider's company for $850 million, and this in turn provided him with cash to continue building the tower. And as you will recall, Vneshekonombank is the same bank, the head of which met with Jared Kushner during the transition. Of course, the story as to why the meeting took place diverged. According to Kushner, this was merely a diplomatic meet and greet. According to Vneshekonombank, which put out an official statement, the meeting was to discuss the Kushner companies. Central to the narrative are also developments abroad, particularly in Central Asia. We have towers in Georgia and Azerbaijan that have been undertaken by the Trump Organization. And here too we have state-connected oligarchs, money with questionable provenance. Various investigative reporters, including Adam Davidson of The New Yorker, have done a phenomenal job of exploring these projects, looking into the red flags and potential ways the dealings there could have tripped U.S. laws, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There's one other project I will highlight, and that's the Panama Trump Ocean Club. Global Witness, a nonprofit NGO, recently did a report that outlined vast-scale alleged money laundering that was taking place through that property. What's also interesting there is it's in Panama, and you wouldn't necessarily think of Russian money in a Panamanian property. However, the report has also outlined that the main consumers that were sort of drawn to this project were Russian buyers. The brokers for the project were mostly from the former Soviet Union, and they specifically catered to the Russian market, both in Panama but also abroad in the United States, in Canada, in Russia. And so this theme of Russian money sustaining Trump properties continues on abroad. So we talked quite a bit about Trump's financial connections to Russia and the former Soviet Union, and this merely touches the tip of the iceberg. Why is this all important? Well, when we speak about Russian money abroad, when we talk about the oligarchs, we are also talking about the Russian state and the Kremlin. We know that Putin has consolidated power over the Russian oligarchy and its business elites, and in effect, they become an extension of the state. And so when we're talking about Russian money in Trump's properties, we also need to understand what the parallel Kremlin strategy is. And with that, Max will come back and talk to you about the Kremlin strategy.
Thanks, Diana. Critical to understanding Russian strategy is to understand the thought process of Vladimir Putin. Putin, from when he was a little boy, had wanted to be an intelligence operative. He wanted to join the KGB, and he achieved that dream. And in fact, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, something that we think sort of brought freedom to Eastern Europe, Putin was actually a KGB station officer in Dresden in East Germany. And here, this was, I think, a critical to understanding Putin's outlook. Because what happened, there was, one, with the fall of the Berlin Wall effectively meant that Putin's job was in doubt, that the Soviet Union collapsed, something he called the greatest geopolitical tragedy. He was forced to go back to St. Petersburg, and when the KGB downsized, he lost his job. So democratic revolution, liberal movements, what that means to Putin is in effect chaos and disorder, and it hurt him personally. And then he looks at what happened to Russia in the 1990s, where it was chaos and disorder. So when Putin comes to power in 2000, he's trying to consolidate his control over the Russian state. And while he's doing this, there's also liberal uprisings that are taking place throughout the former Soviet Union. In Ukraine, they have the Orange Revolution in 2004. In Georgia, they have the Rose Revolution in 2003. And Putin sees these as direct threats to his own power. He's trying to consolidate control. And if there's this liberal democracy that is emerging in Ukraine or in Georgia, then that could serve as an inspiration for people to take to the streets and to overthrow him in Moscow. And in 2011, Putin's worst nightmare seems to be coming true, that there is a fraudulent parliamentary election, and then people start to take to the streets in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton comes out and says that the US government has serious concerns about the Russian election, calls them fraudulent. Putin then directly sort of blames her in the United States for being behind these uprisings, these revolutions. And so we start to see Putin start to really, his attitudes towards America, his sense that the US is trying to undermine him, really take hold. But the straw that really breaks the camel's back is in 2014. And in 2014, there's the Maidan Revolution. This is where people take to the streets in Kiev to oust and to remove the Kremlin-linked president, Viktor Yanukovych. Now this uprising, this revolution, really strikes a chord with Putin. Immediately following Viktor Yanukovych fleeing Ukraine, Putin seizes Crimea, and the US and Europe respond by putting sanctions on Russia. Now, for the United States and Europe, this was an effort to try to punish Russia and to say, hey, stop doing this, stop these actions, change your behavior. But for Russia, they really saw this as the beginning of a new Cold War, as the gloves needed to come off. And so what does Putin do, an old KGB operative? Well, he brushes off the KGB playbook. He starts to, first of all, invest in developing groups and far right and far left political movements, political parties that can sort of sow discord in the West, that can upset the political balance. So we have the Marine Le Pen, the National Front in France of the far right. And we saw in the French elections in 2017 that Marine Le Pen even traveled to Moscow to meet with Putin just weeks before the election, and that her campaign was allegedly even funded in part by loans from a Russian bank. But then even trying to sow discord with some groups that don't have a lot of chance of succeeding. The Texas Nationalist Movement, the Yes California, secessionist groups here in the United States that they're trying to sort of sow discord. This is sort of a venture capitalist strategy to alt-right and alt-left political movements. And the second thing we see is that using the oligarch network, using the corruption, using the wealth that Russia's created through its gas and oil to serve as a lever of corruption. This great report from the Center for Strategic International Studies, which came out in October of 2016 by a former Bush administration official, the Kremlin Playbook, outlines how the Russians operate in Eastern Europe to undermine democracy. They're trying to corrode it, corrupt it from the inside. And the third thing is that the Russians look to exploit the new online information environment. This is, the setting up troll farms in St. Petersburg, using their cyber hackers to hack into political campaigns and into organizations all over the world. And there's one key quote from a cybersecurity advisor to President Putin, who says that you think we're living in 2016? No, we're living in 1948, because this is when the Soviet Union had its first atomic bomb test. And then he went on and warned us that we are on the verge of having something in the information arena which will allow us to talk to the Americans as equals. This is in January of 2016. And 2 years later, we now know what he was talking about. So before moving on to the next part of our presentation, we're going to take some of your questions. We're going to be back with Versha and Diana.
Thank you guys so much for a great presentation so far. We do have some more to go, but we wanted to take some of your questions. We've been watching the comments as we've been going along, and we know you guys have been following the story for some time. So Max, you were just talking about cyber threats. Obviously, this was an issue in the 2016 election, but now looking forward to the 2018 election, that's a common concern with our viewers. What should we be looking out for?
Well, I think we need to look out for the same things that we saw in the 2016 election, that Russia has this immense cyber capability. They have an ability to hack in the accounts of political candidates, of their campaigns, and they could do the same thing, hack those candidates, get emails, and then leak those emails, release them through WikiLeaks or other organizations like that. And so I think that is a real concern. We also know that Russia still has troll farms. They still have bots that are operating online that are trying to sort of pollute our political discourse. I think that's something that the American public is now sort of more awoke to, but it is something that is a real concern, that they can still cause mischief in our dialogue and our public discourse.
You've given this presentation to some news organizations on Capitol Hill, to other policymakers. Is that a real concern you're hearing from that community? Do you feel like they're preparing for it, or do you feel like we're perhaps not as prepared as we should be?
No, it's a real concern. We're definitely not as prepared as we should be. The cybersecurity of many members and their campaigns on the Hill is not up to where it should be. They're still operating old technology, and so getting new technology, making sure that candidates and our politicians requires resources. It requires Congress to devote money so that they have the cybersecurity tools that they need to protect themselves. And so a number of people on the Hill that I've heard from are concerned about their susceptibility to Russian hacking, or not even just Russian hacking, but hacking by foreign governments, even by companies that are seeking to always gain more information, gain more intelligence. So it's a real problem.
Right. So going back to Trump's finances, because there's so much to unpack there, you've pieced together a pretty complete picture already, just based on what's out there. But how much would the release of Trump's tax returns help shed light on this issue? Is there a lot that we still don't know because we haven't seen them? Or what's the role that they play in all of this?
Yes, there's still quite a bit that we don't know. The Trump Organization is a private entity. It's not publicly traded. It doesn't have shareholders, a board of directors, so they don't have to make as many disclosures to, let's say, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So there's still there are large gaps in terms of what we know about the sources of income. And so for Trump as well, the tax returns would potentially show if there are foreign bank accounts, if there are foreign sources of funds that are going into him and the organization. And so I think the release of the tax returns would in fact help us build out a better picture of what's happening in terms of the finances and who he may be beholden to.
Do you have any hope that we'll see them in the next couple of years, or do you think this is something that there needs to be enough public support in order to get Congress to make a move on this, or do you think it's really just up to Trump?
Well, I think it depends what happens in the November elections. And I think if Democrats take power, I think there'll be a move to subpoena his tax returns. Okay. And I think then, we should be able to see what Trump has been hiding all this time.
Okay. One of the slides that stood out to me was the Donald risk, and talking about what he was like to work with in the 90s and the known risks that were associated with him. So even after that, why did people continue to work with the Trump organization? That was just, one of the questions I had. How was he able to keep making deals?
So with the traditional banks, as we discussed, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, they learned their lesson. After several bankruptcies and after projects have gone bust, they knew to stay away. However, Trump was always creative about finding alternative means of finance. And we see this pivot, especially in the mid-2000s, to foreign licensing deals, where in essence, he doesn't have to provide financing, but there were still individuals, especially in foreign countries, that were excited by the prospect of building a Trump Tower. Trump's name retained its cachet abroad in some cases, and so that people, it was a means for them to build a glitzy tower. In newly capitalized countries, if you will, there is still kind of this aspect of consumerism, and Trump was the kind of embodiment of glitz and glamour. And so we see his business taking a shift to more of licensing deals that he was able to continue to do. And so for that, he didn't need the banks to lend him money to actually build the towers.
Right. All right. So I think we've got a little more to go. Max is going to bring it all together for us, and then we're going to wrap up by taking even more questions. So keep letting us know what you think in the comments. And Max, you want to give us a little preview of this final act?
Yeah. So now we're going to sort of bring together Trump's business connections with Russia, Russian strategy, and bring that together both before the election, during the election, and then immediately after, and try to tie it all together. Okay, so let's bring Trump's business ties to Russia, Russian foreign policy strategy. Let's try to bring those two together. Now, I think it's important to remember that Donald Trump, when Barack Obama was running for president, and then immediately afterwards, actually said very nice things about Barack Obama. He said he's totally a champion. That was as late as 2010. Yet then a year later in 2011, Donald Trump is at the forefront of the birther movement, birtherism. Now, what is birtherism? Now, birtherism is a conspiracy theory that effectively calls into question the very legitimacy of U.S. democracy. It's saying that Barack Obama wasn't born in America and therefore is an illegitimate president. Now, pushing this conspiracy theory, Donald Trump's a guy with a vast Twitter following, that he's a media star, would be like sending a red signal flare to the Russians, that here's someone pushing the exact sort of narrative that they would want to cultivate. Now, it's also, I think, worth noting that in 2011 is when Christopher Steele, in his dossier, notes that alleges that this is when the Russians seek to develop a relationship with Donald Trump. This is actually one of the biggest allegations in the entire dossier. And Steele cites 4 different sources that say that for at least 5 years, so starting in 2011, that the Russians came to Trump and tried to develop a relationship. Now, what were the Russians allegedly interested in that information that Trump had? Well, the comings and goings of rich Russians in Donald Trump's property. They had all these Russians investing in Trump's properties, and so the Russians wanted to keep tabs on what the comings and goings of these Russian oligarchs. Now, we don't know if that's true, but that's one of the most significant allegations, and Steele cites 4 different sources, one of whom was actually believed to be killed on December 26, 2016, a former Russian intelligence figure. So that is something that the U.S. government would definitely be looking to explore further. But in November 2013 is when we sort of see these, Donald Trump's businesses and Donald Trump as the budding politicians start to converge. He brings the Miss Universe pageant to Moscow, and there he rubs elbows with Kremlin-linked oligarchs and senior Russian officials. And then he has meetings and dinners with a number of figures that we're going to see again at that now infamous June 9th meeting in Trump Tower in 2016. The Miss Universe pageant is paid for and brought to Moscow by Arasa Galarov, a major Kremlin oligarch. Trump films a music video for his son, Amina Galarov. He's the guy that reaches out to Donald Trump Jr. In June of 2016. Donald Trump films that music video in now the boardroom of that infamous Ritz-Carlton hotel. And then after the Miss Universe pageant, Donald Trump comes back to America. He has interviews and holds a press conference and gives a speech where he says that he had a great time and had a great connection with Vladimir Putin. Says he spoke directly or indirectly with Vladimir Putin. So let's go to the election. Now, we've often heard a lot about the C word, collusion. Now, collusion is a word that doesn't really have a defined legal meaning. It's really secret cooperation for an illegal or deceitful purpose. And I think what we'll see throughout the election is that there was a lot of collusion, that there was a constant sort of interaction, meetings between a Russian campaign to elect Donald Trump and the Trump campaign. We oftentimes think that this all sort of began with that now infamous June 9th meeting. But in fact, through press reporting, it's become clear that there was a lot of contacts and interactions between Russian intelligence figures and Trump associates going back into 2015. That there's reporting that British, French, Dutch, German, Estonian, Polish intelligence all picked up on meetings and contacts between Trump associates and the Russians. And that goes back into 2015. And why does 2015 matter? Well, that's before before many people were on the campaign. That was when Trump was running in the primary, and it was basically just him running sort of a campaign about getting, where he tried to get free media attention, was doing constant interviews. So if there's people meeting with the Russians, it's likely someone very close to Trump. And we also have to remember that during the primary, Trump was one of 16 candidates, and he's the only one to actually say positive things about Vladimir Putin. Now, Trump is a Republican presidential candidate, and here he is saying very positive things about Vladimir Putin. It was unheard of in the foreign policy world. The Republicans are the ones that are supposed to be hawkish on Russia, and here Trump is advocating a pro-engagement line with the Russians. And then we also learned that at this time, Michael Cohen, Felix Aider are actively trying to get a Trump Tower built in Moscow, while Trump is adhering to this very pro-Putin positive line on Russia. So then in February, March of 2016 is when I think this really all starts to come together. Now we have to remember that in February, Trump suddenly started to win primaries and caucuses. He wins 3 out of the 4 in February. He has a big primary day on March 1st where he basically sweeps the field. And so at this point, this is when it seems like the Russians basically go all in. And what we know is that from the intelligence community report that I mentioned earlier, this is when the Russians actively start their online effort to support Donald Trump. This is also when the Russians hack John Podesta's email account in March of 2016. And then suddenly we see Donald Trump looking like he's going to be the Republican nominee, and he has to start building out his campaign. And this is when we now see all these Russia-linked figures joining the campaign. We have Carter Page joining as a foreign policy advisor. Now, Carter Page, just a few years earlier, was being actively recruited by Russian intelligence. In fact, the FBI, in a sting operation, bugged a binder which 2 Russian agents brought into the Russian embassy, where they're overheard talking about Carter Page. And one of the things they say about him is he showed great enthusiasm. And here Carter Page is joining the Trump campaign in March of 2016. Another figure, George Papadopoulos, who is basically unheard of. He's in his mid-20s, joins the campaign as a foreign policy advisor. And then we have Michael Flynn, just a few months earlier was actually at the table sitting next to Vladimir Putin at this RT gala. And we now know was getting paid by Russian government sources for consulting work and for other activities. And then there's Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort, who volunteered to join the campaign, who was, a few years earlier, was one of the closest political advisors to Viktor Yanukovych, that Ukrainian pro-Kremlin president who had to flee in disgrace. Now, Manafort has vast ties to Russia, vast ties to the Kremlin, and joins as the campaign chairman in March of 2016. And then after March, then suddenly we see all these meetings and contacts between Trump campaign officials and Kremlin-linked officials. And then this brings us to the June 9th meeting, this now infamous meeting. And it's important to remember this begins with an email from a representative of a Russian oligarch saying that the Russian government has damaging information on Hillary Clinton, has dirt on Hillary Clinton. And Donald Trump Jr.'s response is not to go to the FBI about that, but it's to say, if it is what I think it is, I would love it. And then what does he do? He immediately works to set up the meeting. He sets up the meeting within a week. And not only does he attend, but he brings the campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner. Now, the Russian side is sort of an Ocean's 11 of cast of characters. There's Natalia Veselnitskaya, the Russian government lawyer. There's someone that has alleged connections to Russian intelligence, an alleged money launderer. All are participating in this meeting. And what this meeting shows, the important thing about this meeting, is that it shows that the Trump campaign was willing to collude with the Russians. They wanted to know what dirt the Russians had on Hillary Clinton. They were eager to get it. And it looks like the Russians were also eager to provide it. So in this meeting, we've established the will to collude. This meeting is collusion. It's a secret meeting for an illegal or deceitful purpose. The Russians providing dirt on Hillary Clinton is illegal. It's against federal election law. But one question we need to ask ourselves, now that we know that they're willing to collude, to what end? How deep does the collusion go? And so this is where we sometimes need to speculate. We need to say, okay, if you were running a political campaign and were willing to accept Russia's help, a foreign government's help, how could the Russians actually help you? Well, one is through opposition research. And this is a quote from Marco Rubio, who noted that imagine being able to benefit from basically the capabilities of a state entity with their vast cyber capabilities. They could hack your opponent and then they could leak it. And this is exactly what we saw. So, to go back, we know that John Podesta's emails, the Clinton campaign chairman, was hacked in March of 2016. We know the Russians reached out to this guy, George Papadopoulos, to say, hey, we have this dirt on Hillary Clinton. We've hacked their campaign. And Papadopoulos then, and we know this through the Mueller indictments of Papadopoulos, then informed senior people in the campaign that the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton. We then know that Roger Stone knew in August that John Podesta's email had been hacked. He said, John Podesta's time in the barrel is coming. Podesta has no idea at this point in August of 2016 that his email's been hacked. We also know that the Trump campaign had a back channel to Julian Assange. We know that there was direct messages being exchanged between Donald Trump Jr. And the WikiLeaks account. Now, we then have to look at the timing of the release of all of this. Now, WikiLeaks is supposed to be a nonprofit organization. Now, if you're a nonprofit organization, you're looking to get the most bang for your buck. When having a big release. One thing you probably wouldn't do is then release it on a Friday afternoon in October. And one thing you probably definitely wouldn't do is then release it 29 minutes after the biggest bombshell of the election. On October 7th at 4:03 p.m., this is when the Access Hollywood tape is released. And then 29 minutes later, we have WikiLeaks releasing John Podesta's email, the first tranche of those emails. It sure looks like WikiLeaks wasn't operating according to a timeline that suits their interests, but was operating according to a timeline that would suit the Trump campaign. And then the next thing we know is that the Trump campaign basically based their final month of the campaign on the WikiLeaks emails. Trump mentioned him 164 times in the last month of the campaign. That's 5 times a day. So he based his strategy, seemingly, around the release of John Podesta's emails. The big question that is left unanswered is, did the Trump campaign actually get those emails ahead of time, and did they coordinate upon the release of those emails? And so the other way that the Russians could help the Trump campaign is through communication support. And this we basically know happened. This is where the use of Russian bots to sow discord in our electorate, to pollute our public discourse, but also to attack Hillary Clinton viciously, to pollute pro-Hillary hashtags, to infiltrate groups of Bernie Sanders supporters to try to cause discord amongst the Democratic base. Another way that the Russians could have provided support is through money. Now, we know campaigns always need money. And one of the things that the Mueller investigation is reportedly looking into is whether the Russians funneled money into the campaign. Now, they could have done that through buying ads on Facebook, which we know they did through the Internet Research Agency. But this is where the whole NRA story comes in. And this is where McClatchy has reported that the Mueller investigation is looking into whether the Russians basically funneled money into the NRA that they could then use for political purposes. And we know the NRA spent about 3 times as much to support Donald Trump as they did Mitt Romney during the 2016 election. There's likely going to be a lot more investigation on this front. So to pull this all together, one question that's often raised is, well, what are the Russians getting out of this? Well, one thing is that the Russians are trying to sow discord in American politics. Remember, Vladimir Putin sort of blames Hillary Clinton for those protests in 2011. But so one of the signals that the Trump campaign might have sent to the Russians to say, hey, we will be good stewards of Russia policy, we'll try to engage, be supportive of engagement with Russia, is they could actually just tell them that. And that's exactly what happened. When Carter Page, Trump's foreign policy advisor, went to Moscow to give a big speech that was highly touted by the Kremlin, that here's a Republican advisor to a Republican president saying very pro-Kremlin things. That speech could have been written by the Kremlin itself. It adhered to their talking points so closely. That would have sent a clear signal to the Kremlin that's something that they would have really been interested in. The other thing is that you could water down the Republican platform. That the Republican platform, one of the major arguments that Republicans were making against the Obama administration is that the Obama administration refused to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. And that was the major Republican attack from the Republicans on the Hill to the administration. Yet the only thing they changed during the Republican Party platform in the convention is they strip out that language. They take out that language. And that would have sent a clear signal to Moscow. That is something that Russian diplomats, look at this text very closely and would say, yes, they took out that language. And then what we see is that immediately that at the Republican National Convention, that there's another meeting that takes place. That here there's a meeting with Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, goes to the Republican Convention. Now, it's not unusual for ambassadors to go to political conventions, but Kislyak doesn't go to the Democratic Convention. And then this is a meeting that all those involved lie about. They say that never occurred. And then we know that 2 days after this, that's when the WikiLeaks publishes its first batch of stolen DNC emails. They hacked the Democratic National Committee, and they released those emails timed to sow discord within the Democratic Party. And the U.S. government immediately says that the Russians were behind this, and yet Donald Trump the next day calls on Russia to do more hacking, to find Hillary Clinton's 30,000 emails, and they continue to hack the Clinton campaign. So then in the aftermath of the election, what we see is immediately Russian diplomats actually sort of spiking the football. One Russian diplomat says, of course there were meetings, there was contacts, we were in touch with the Trump team. And I think what's important to understand is the Russians actually didn't think Donald Trump was going to win. I don't think Donald Trump thought he was going to win. But what they were trying to do was sort of sow discord throughout the election to try to build up Trump as a political force. But then immediately after he wins, they're trying to, what looks like trying to take advantage of it. So there's a meeting on December 1st between Ambassador Kislyak and Jared Kushner and Mike Flynn. Then a couple of weeks later, Sergei Gorkov comes to Trump Tower. This is the head of this big Russian bank, where he has a meeting with Jared Kushner. And what's important, all these meetings were covered up. They lied about all these meetings. That these meetings aren't nefarious, and why are you lying about it? And then we have at the end of the month, Ambassador Kislyak and Mike Flynn having 5 phone calls. Now this happened immediately after the Obama administration sanctioned a number of Russian individuals, evicted a number of Russian diplomats, and there's phone calls between Kislyak and Flynn. They have 5 of them. Now, what happened on these phone calls, we still don't know. We still don't know what was talked about. But what we know that the content was so concerning that the then Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates pointed to the underlying conduct, and that this prompted Sally Yates to then say, we need to have the FBI go interview Mike Flynn. And then what happens is that Putin doesn't retaliate. He doesn't respond to these sanctions. Now, what never makes any sense about all of this is that why would Mike Flynn lie about this? It doesn't quite make sense, because if you're trying to get Russia not to sanction the United States, that's in the interest of the United States. Yet Flynn never makes that argument. He just said that they weren't talking about sanctions. Sanctions never came up. But of course we know they did come up. And then the story is that Flynn is fired because he lied to the vice president. But it's now become clear that Flynn was coordinating what he was saying with Mar-a-Lago, with the people that were based there. So there's a lot more to unpack about what happened around these 5 phone calls. Then we know that there's this bizarre meeting in the Seychelles involving Eric Prince acting as a representative of the Trump transition team to reportedly establish a back channel with the Russians. This involves a number of figures from the UAE, some of which will then lead to the Mueller investigation sort of spinning into what looks like now a corruption investigation. But then on January 20th, when Trump's coming into office, what becomes clear is the Trump administration is looking to get rid of Russia sanctions. Now, the sanctions that the Obama administration put in place in 2014 were very harmful to the Russian economy. The Russians were trying to get out from under them again and again and again. They were trying to sort of divide Europe. But here, the Trump transition team comes into office and tries to get rid of them. But they're stopped. And one of the reasons why they're stopped is because there was a huge uproar about what was happening, and members of Congress were really concerned about the Trump administration would get rid of Russia sanctions. And so they passed their own Russia sanctions legislation, something the administration has opposed again and again and again and failed to effectively implement. So to wrap up, we know there's a web of connections between Trump campaign officials and Trump himself and Russian government officials. We know that there were at least 70 contacts and 22 meetings during the campaign and the transition between the Trump team and Russian government-linked officials. And we know that there's been at least 22 indictments, that Trump's campaign manager has been indicted, his national security advisor, Trump's deputy campaign manager, and a member of his foreign policy team, Papadopoulos, and that these people have pled guilty. And we also know that there's been a vast cover-up in place, that they've lied about all these meetings, about all these contacts again and again and again. So where we are, I think, is a story that is actually quite simple. This is about a campaign that was willing to do whatever it took to try to win, to get a leg up on its opponent, and was willing to work with whoever came along. And here's a country in Russia that was looking to strike back at Hillary Clinton, strike back at the United States, sow discord in the United States, and saw in Trump someone they could work with, and someone that was pushing their sort of alt-right extremist brand of politics that they wanted to push. And so this isn't some doesn't require Vladimir Putin to have sort of advanced knowledge. This is about interests converging, the interests of a business, the interests of a government, and the interests of a campaign all converging into a perfect storm in the 2016 election. So I know we've thrown a ton of information at you. Versha's going to come back, Deanna's going to come back, and we're going to take some of your questions and we're going to sort of unpack some of what we just talked about.
All right, so we're in the final stretch here. We're just, again, taking some of your questions and comments, and I've got some questions for you guys myself. Again, this has been such a helpful, informative presentation, so thank you. One thing I do want to address is that the Center for American Progress was founded by John Podesta back in 2003. He was obviously a key player in the 2016 campaign. He was a victim of the hacks himself. So how do you deal with any accusations of possible bias in your research in this project?
Well, I think, Podesta, who created CAP and then is the chairman of the board, this is something he's clearly concerned about. This is something the entire organization was clearly concerned about, which was the Russian interference in the election. And so because of that concern, it spawned this project. I think if we weren't as concerned about it, we probably wouldn't have this project in looking into it. So I think it's his interest that him being a victim of this project, but I think more broadly that that the United States was attacked, and that there's a need to look into what happened and need to really get to the bottom of it. And yeah, I think he may have felt it a bit more acutely than many Americans. But this was something that I think that there was a clear sense that we really need to look into what happened and to get to the bottom of it so we prevent it from happening again.
And having worked in the U.S. government yourself, can you talk a little bit about how rare or how common it is for there to be consensus in the intelligence community about something like this?
So I think it's not altogether rare, especially when there's a big event and everyone's sort of on the same page. What was rare in this case is that it had just happened, and that this was not something the U.S. intelligence community was really focused on. They weren't focused on Russia during the 2016 election the same way they have been on terrorism, for instance, in the years after 9/11. So this sort of there was sort of a whiplash in the US intelligence community, but there was unanimity partly because the Russians weren't interested in hiding their tracks. That the Russians were very clear on letting the US know that they did this. They did the hacking of the DNC during Russian business hours. They left Cyrillic characters all over the hacking. And why? Because they wanted to leave a calling card. So it was quite obvious what had happened from an intelligence standpoint. And they then could go back and look at all the data, all the information they had, and the story was quite clear. And I think that's why we have the unanimity of the intelligence community that we did with that report in January of 2017.
Okay. So you've gone into detail about a lot of the finances, a lot of the political connections and meetings. The big picture that I think a lot of our viewers and a lot of Americans just want to know is, A, was there collusion? B, will Trump get in any legal trouble for it? And C, why is this a big deal? Because we do also have Fox News going on the offense, right? And saying, well, if there was collusion, who really cares? Does it matter?
Yeah.
So what's your take on this?
So I think, A, there definitely was collusion. The June 9th meeting is just straight up collusion. It was a secret meeting for an illegal or deceitful purpose. And I think the question is whether he will be held accountable. It is dependent on the Mueller investigation. I think it's clear that the Mueller investigation is pulling thread after thread and lead after lead. And it's essential that that investigation be allowed to continue. And then if the Mueller investigation finds out what we think is pretty clear, that there was collusion and that Trump clearly knew about it since he's the one who ran his own campaign, then the question about whether he's held accountable is really dependent on the American public. You know, Congress is responsive to the American people. It's about then Congress stepping up and doing what it needs to do, which is hold the president accountable. Now, maybe the Mueller investigation will fall short of proving certain things, but Congress's role will then become apparent, and this will be a major test of U.S. democracy, of our institutions, and whether rule of law in the United States still is going to still stand.
Deanna, the Mueller investigation has gotten a lot of credit for following the money and going after Manafort, going after the business associates. In your experience, do you feel like they're pulling all of the right threads in the right order? What's your kind of take on how this investigation has evolved?
I think Mueller is doing a great job based on what we've seen from the indictments. You mentioned Manafort, and the issues that he's pursuing are many, right? Yeah. So there is issues of money laundering, potential corruption. And so I think it is very important because the questions that are raised go beyond collusion and coordination with a foreign power. We're looking back decades, and some of the relationships that become troubling in the course of the campaign have started very early on. And so I think their approach is very comprehensive. That said, white-collar crimes, financial crimes are notoriously difficult to prove and to investigate, and so, but based on what we've seen to date, I think the investigation has been very meticulous and will turn up quite a bit.
So what happens if Mueller gets fired?
So what happens if Mueller gets fired? I mean, that's sort of how democracy dies, in effect. We've seen lots of other test cases around the world where one of the first things that goes with a democracy is the independent judiciary. Independent is the rule of law. And so if Trump fires Mueller, someone we know is investigating him and his associates and his family and his organization and his campaign, it will be a real test case for U.S. democracy. Then what do we do as a response as citizens? What does Congress do? But if Mueller is fired, there's still going to be people at the FBI that are going to have leads to investigate. And so the hope is that will be able to continue. But I think it's then incumbent upon the American people to make it known that that's unacceptable.
So speaking of famous firings, we're coming up on almost a year since Trump fired James Comey, which was similar to what you're saying in a lot of ways. It was a test case. It was a big moment for democracy. He's now going on a book tour. Yeah. Is there anything in his book that you've read or from his recent press interviews that adds to any of this, or is it kind of everything that we already knew, which is Trump went on national television after he fired Comey and said he did it to obstruct the investigation?
Well, I think what's interesting is that everything Comey has said about Trump has been borne out by the release of the memos that he wrote, the simultaneous memos and reports that he then sent to his colleagues after meeting with the president. And what becomes clear is that Trump was obsessed with trying to get rid of this investigation, wanted to make sure that Comey wasn't going to investigate him, pressured him, put on the charm. And Comey documented all of that. It's all clear. And the person who's lying is clearly the President of the United States, not James Comey. And I think the other thing that comes out of his book is I think Comey actually botched 2 investigations in 2016. He botched the Clinton email investigation by inserting himself into U.S. politics at the very end, by holding that press conference that was really intended, to in some ways show that his conservative critics that he was independent. But then he also botched the Russia investigation. Just days before the election, the FBI basically put out, told the New York Times that there was no investigation into Donald Trump. And we now know that wasn't true. And so I think the American people went to vote with incomplete information. And it was a mistake on the part of James Comey to make one thing public and not the other. And I think he feels badly about that, and I think that comes through in his book. But I think history is going to judge him for that.
So you mentioned the Steele dossier in the presentation. We know not everything in that dossier has been verified, though a lot of it has been. So what are some of the other sources of information that you've pulled together for this project and for your research?
So, we've looked, there's been, as we all know, a ton of press reporting. And so, that was sort of one basic challenge, was actually just keeping up with all the press reporting that has taken place, and then remembering reporting that had occurred during the election, and then even reporting that occurred, in 2017. The other thing that we've looked at is just looking at analyzing Russian foreign policy strategy. That was something that I often had to look at when I was in government, and basing our assessments and our calculations and on what we've seen Russia do in the past, what we've seen Russia do in Eastern Europe. And so some of the think tank reports that I've cited, other academic work, and then you can talk about some of the financial side of this.
Yes, so on the subject of following the money, we're also trying to be comprehensive. We have analysts who are fluent in Russian, who are very versed in navigating Russian public records, so corporate records, so we can look into certain companies who are the shareholders, directors, and establish connections that way. So we try to amplify the public reporting that's been done with also original research and primary source information.
So based on your research, what do you think is the most damning part of the research or the investigation? Or do you feel like it is everything together?
I think everything together, because it's actually a fairly simple story. And so I think, yes, I think if right now we discovered that there was this meeting in Trump Tower between Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort and the Russians, it would be, I think it would convince everyone, yes, collusion occurred. But we actually heard that a year ago.
Right.
I just think that we as a public and as a country, we're still grappling with this whole story. And I think that is incredibly damning. But also just some basic factual things that we know. We know Roger Stone had an advanced warning of John Podesta's emails being hacked. And so there's a lot of tidbits of information that all sort of add up to something that's really damning. I think the final thing is just all the lying, all the
cover-up. Yep.
If you have a meeting with the Russian ambassador, now maybe you could say, if you're Jeff Sessions and you had a meeting with a Russian ambassador and you didn't want to disclose it because it would be politically damaging. You said, no, I didn't have this meeting. Well, then if that got exposed, you would then say, oh, okay, I admit to having that meeting. But then you would think you would reveal the other meetings that you had had. But what we see from them time and time again is like, no, we just had that meeting, that's it, there was no others. And then there's another meeting, then there's another meeting, another meeting. Why are they lying about all these meetings? And they're acting guilty. And I think that is one of the things that is just at the core of this, is that we know the Russians were interfering in our election. We know the Trump campaign and Trump associates are lying about it again and again and again. And the question is why? And it's quite obvious, because they're hiding something.
And from my perspective, I focus on financial malfeasance, I focus on issues of corruption, conflicts of interest. And so the pattern that has been established of troubling both projects but also business partnerships is, in my sense, very damning. We have someone who is on the presidential campaign trail and at the same time trying to build a tower in Moscow. And the conflicts of interest that sort of are laid bare in some of these interactions are pretty incredible. And so I think that, added with the interactions with the government-linked operatives, kind of brings this picture together.
I think that's an important point, because I think the finances and the conflicts of interest have kind of played second fiddle in the headlines, but it is an equally damning part of the investigation and everything that we know. All right, thank you guys so much again. How can people follow your updates as the investigation continues and as your work continues?
Great. You can go to our website, themoscowproject.org, or follow us on Twitter at Moscow_project.
Awesome. Thank you guys for watching Now This. Stay tuned to Now This Politics, the Russia Desk, and the Moscow Project for more.